I can see the people just logging in.
Okay, good. Well, welcome everybody. We'll begin with a prayer in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Saint Philip, pray for us. Our Lady, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Faith and Reason lecture hosted by the Newman Center at the University of Toronto. I am delighted to serve as your moderator this evening. I'd like to begin by sharing with you a quotation, something I read recently, which frames succinctly what likely was the inspiration for the Newman Faith and Reason lecture series. It's a quotation from a paper written by Nathaniel Peters, published in the November issue of Public Discourse, and it speaks to faith and reason in the thought of John Henry Newman. And I quote, "Faith and reason," St. John Henry Newman argues, "are not opposed mental actions, but a similar intellectual act operating on different grounds. Faith reasons not from direct empirical evidence placed before us, nor from principles that the intellect has grasped on its own, but from grounds of trust or probability based on inclinations and dispositions of the heart." With those thoughts of St. John Henry Newman in mind, we are honored to welcome this evening as the Faith and Reason lecturer, Father Philip Cleevely, who will speak on the development of doctrine. I'm going to give a formal introduction to about Father Philip in a moment, but before I do, Lenita is going to give you some housekeeping directions in terms of how we're going to proceed this evening. Lenita?
So welcome again. Thank you for joining us this evening. For questions, please keep in mind that our chat box will not be monitored throughout the evening. However, our Q&A is open. You're welcome to write questions there throughout the lecture or at the end, and then we'll have a Q&A period following Father Philip Cleevely's lecture here with us tonight.
I'm going to now introduce Father Philip Cleevely. Father is a professor at the St. Philip Neri Seminary in Toronto, where he teaches philosophy and spirituality to the students in the seminary. Father Philip was born in England in 1966. He studied English language and literature at the University of Oxford and pedagogy at the University of Cambridge. In 1989, he was received into the Roman Catholic Church, and in 1993 entered the Birmingham Oratory. A very special place for all of us. The Birmingham Oratory is a community that was founded and shaped by St. John Henry Newman himself, the patron saint of this parish community and this Newman mission. Father subsequently pursued studies in philosophy, first at Oxford University and then at St. Philip's Seminary here in Toronto. This was followed by 3 years of theological studies at the Dominican University of St. Thomas, known as the Angelicum, in Rome. He was ordained on December 14th, 2001. In early 2011, he requested and received a transitus from his community in Birmingham to the Oratorian community here in Toronto. Since joining the Toronto Oratory, he's been fortunate in having the opportunity to participate in the work of St. Philip's Seminary, teaching in both philosophy and in the theology division, faith, hope, and charity. And with Father Derek Cross, human action and beatitude. In addition, he has also served as Dean of Students in the seminary. Other responsibilities that he's taken on include being the chaplain to the Missionaries of Charity, collaborating in the design and composition of the Oratory website. And I highly recommend, if you haven't visited the Oratory website, you should. It's a beautiful website. And Father Philip is also was closely involved in the early years of the Renovatia campaign, which resulted in a beautiful building that is now the Toronto Oratory and the Seminary. At present, Father Philip acts as secretary to the Deputy and General Congregations and assists in overseeing the Oratory's communications ad extra. As recreation, among other things, Father Philip voraciously explores the four-hand piano repertoire in partnership with Dr. Aaron James and accompanies Brother Christopher Hinn, a German leader, and the songs of Stephen Sondheim. So with that very interesting background and bio, please join me in welcoming Father Philip.
Well, thank you very much for that generous and wide-ranging introduction, and for which I have only myself to blame, since it's my own composition, and which I wrote for the Oratory website. So I'm very grateful to you, nonetheless, for spending the time to read it so carefully. And I'm grateful also for this invitation, though I've been given a vast and very difficult subject in theology to talk about, namely the development of doctrine. I shall be offering, I hope, some fairly sequential and consequential remarks on certain aspects of Newman's thinking about this question of Christianity and development. And in the course of doing so, I shall be also making some more incidental remarks on other theological approaches and styles to this question, mostly by way of contrasting them with Newman. I'm very conscious that what I shall have to say will probably raise more questions than it answers. And so I hope to attach particular value to the question and answer session that follows the lecture, when some of those questions which have been provoked by what I say, or others which haven't occurred to me, can be raised and hopefully elucidated to some extent. So let me begin by remarking that Christianity is an historical religion because it is in history that the Christian revelation is communicated. It is in history that Christian experience is lived out. And it is in history that Christian doctrine unfolds and accumulates. And one task of Christian theology is to reflect upon the historical character of Christianity and to try to interpret it and to understand it. And this seems obvious. Concerning the relation between Christianity and history has often manifested a certain tension. We might even speak here of an anxiety. Such tension or anxiety arises because history, whatever else we may say about it, is concerned with what is changeable, fluid and unstable, whereas it has often been the concern of Christian theology to represent Christianity, and especially Christian doctrine, as essentially removed from the realm of change and instability, endowed from the first and always with an immutable identity that transcends historical process. It has, of course, been recognized that Christianity makes itself in some way present to history and must do so in order to be apprehended and believed at all. But this presence to history, and again, thinking here especially of Christian doctrine, this presence to history has often been conceived as a kind of resistant juxtaposition to historical process, rather than as what might be called constitutive involvement with it. By speaking of a constitutive involvement of Christianity and history, I mean to point to the possibility that history, precisely as process, as what is mobile and changeable, need not be thought of as the presently inescapable, but always alien milieu, against which the identity of Christianity must intransigently affirm itself. Instead, and I believe in the spirit of Newman, we can think of Christianity as living and unfolding within history. We can consider it as finding in history its natural and resonant medium of self-understanding and self-expression. From this perspective, it would be through the mingling of Christianity and history that Christianity providentially constitutes itself, rather than as its oppositional other. History can be theologically reimagined as the very medium of Christianity's becoming. Nevertheless, as I have implied, there are various ways in which theology has developed ways of resisting such a reimagining of the role of history in Christian unfolding. Newman himself was conscious of some of these ways and speaks about them. And indeed, in one period of his theological development, his Anglican period, he even himself held such a form of resistance. And it was the dissolution of his belief in this form of resistance that was a major catalyst of his conversion from Anglicanism to Catholicism. So Newman's trajectory into Catholicism is intimately bound up with the question of the form that history takes in Christian life and doctrine. Well, for Newman, one form, notoriously, in which theology has contrived to evade the historical is Protestantism, and he speaks sometimes polemically about this, famously, for example, in saying that to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. There is a sense then for Newman in which Protestantism reflects an estrangement from the historical, and that this estrangement from the historical is, in some sense, a failure of the Christian imagination itself. It is so, I think, for Newman specifically, because he interprets Protestantism, and it doesn't matter for our purposes tonight whether his interpretation is justifiable or not, but he interprets Protestantism as a refusal of tradition. The Protestant claim, he thinks, is that Christianity does not fall within the province of history. And the way in which it does not is that it falls to each man to think what Christianity is. Christianity is to each man what each man thinks it to be, he says, and nothing else. And what is refused here, according to Newman, is the idea of Christianity as something historically mediated and received by the individual, who is incorporated thereby into a community and a tradition. In a sense, he sees Protestant Christianity as requiring an immediacy and clarity of individual commitment to God and to the revelation of God in Christ, which seeks to escape history, its contours and its vicissitudes. It is, of course, a very intelligible desire to wish to escape in some way these things, and a sympathetic interpretation of Protestantism in some of its leading forms might give a more sympathetic reading of Protestant attitudes towards the historical. But for Newman, it's the refusal of tradition. And thereby, I think, in his mind, the refusal also of the fact of history and its constitutive involvement with Christian becoming. But Protestantism is not the only way in which tradition can be occluded from thinking about Christianity and history. In fact, I think Newman came to believe anyway that there are some ways of occluding tradition which are self-professedly concerned with tradition and concerned to emphasize tradition. For example, there are ways of speaking about tradition which interpret it simply as being the handing on of a body of authoritative, timeless teachings. And this handing on is imagined within these theories of tradition that I'm trying to describe. It's imagined as being complete from the beginning and requiring only an exactitude and immutability of transition from one generation to another or from one time to another. In this sense, the act of handing on, the act of tradition, defies the mobility of time and historical circumstance and sets up in that oppositional juxtaposition that I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, sets up a sort of alternative channel of the real to the flux of time and the historical. Newman himself, as an Anglican, as I mentioned a moment ago, Newman himself as an Anglican has a version of that idea of tradition in sort of oppositional existence to history. He imagines that all the apostles, for example, had an explicit knowledge of all subsequent doctrinal development in the church. And to the obvious problem that arises for such a theory, or one of the obvious problems which arises for such a theory, namely, why then did it take so long for what was explicitly transmitted by the apostles to show up again in Christian history down the line of doctrinal development? Newman answers that, in fact, the apostles had a discipline of reserve towards the mysteries of faith, or some of the dogmatic elaborations of those mysteries, which required them to withhold them from those who were ignorant or unlearned or ill-disposed, so that in this way, although there is this explicit plenitude of apostolic knowing, it doesn't transmit itself because of a kind of spiritual or even moral discipline that causes it only to be selectively released into subsequent history until retrieved according to certain patterns of reasoning later on, for example, in conciliar definitions. Now, it's not just the Anglican Newman that holds a view like this, but you can find a similar theory about the fullness of apostolic knowledge and apostolic origins in certain neo-scholastic theologies of tradition. And typically they don't offer the same kind of explanation as Newman offered as an Anglican for why this fullness does not immediately communicate itself to the historical sequel of the apostles. It is left to the ingenuity of various theologians who espouse this view to imagine how it could be that such a fullness of apostolic knowledge had somehow been lost or evaded and only later on recovered. And even in the recovery, it would have been normal for these theologians to say that what was recovered, say in the form of conciliar definitions, was still imperfect with respect to that apostolic fullness of knowledge and understanding that once existed. As I mentioned, Newman comes to abandon theological constructions like these theories because he ceases to see the need for them. And indeed, we can find him in one passage quite consciously reversing the sense which has been very influential in Christian thought, that the origin must be the moment of greatest fullness from which everything else is a form of decline or recession. Of course, such a view that the origins have a plenitude, a potency, that the beginning is always the best, and that everything that comes afterwards is in some sense a derogation. This is a structural component of great importance in the whole view of the historical as being a realm of estrangement or alienation or declining likeness and potency to the origin. But Newman, in a passage in his own essay on Development of Doctrine, very consciously, and I think knowing what he intended to do, reverses that trope of the sense of the fullness of the origin. He writes, "It is indeed sometimes said that the stream is clearest nearer the spring. Whatever use may fairly be made of this image," he says, "it does not apply to the history of a philosophy or belief." And indeed, he's explicitly including Christianity in this passage. He's talking in general about a kind of genealogy of philosophy and belief, but Christianity is for him the exemplary instance of it. "It does not apply," he says, "to the history of a philosophy or belief, which, on the contrary, is more equable and purer and stronger when its bed has become deep and broad and full. It necessarily arises out of an existing state of things, and for a time savors of the soil. Its vital element needs disengaging from what is foreign and temporary, and is employed in efforts after freedom, which become more vigorous and hopeful as its years increase. Its beginnings then," Newman concludes, "its beginnings are no measure of its capabilities nor of its scope." So here, Newman imagines the historical sequel not as an inevitable narrative of decline or estrangement or bereavement or loss of an original fullness, but rather as the ongoing trial and exemplification of the vitality of the idea, of the philosophy or belief or religion. And it is only in this agonistic encounter with the historical that the resources of the original come to light and are established. And this then already introduces us to something of what might be involved in the idea that Christianity has a constitutive involvement with the historical. Constitutive because the historical process itself is the vehicle of the formation by reaction, by assimilation, but it's the vehicle of the reaction whereby Christianity comes to self-expression and self-understanding. Well, we can hear the ongoing reimagination of Christianity in its relation to history, also in another passage of Newman's essay on the development of Christian doctrine, which I shall try to comment on in some detail, because I think it's relatively unobtrusive in a way, but it's also very rich just under the surface. And it enables us to bring into focus some of the main, most important and salient themes of Newman's thinking about the relation between history and Christianity. So in this passage, Newman says that the action of Christianity transpires in what he calls the busy scene of human life. And by this, I think he means that the action of Christianity is inescapably embedded in concrete forms of historical existence. And this embeddedness is the scene of Christian agency, not just, I think, its agency towards others, but also its own agency as self-expression and self-understanding. And about this action of Christianity in the busy scene of human life, Newman tells us that Christianity cannot make progress at all without, he says, cutting across and thereby destroying or modifying and incorporating with itself existing modes of thinking and operating. So here, I think Newman is telling us that Christianity makes progress, which is to say, I would wish to gloss that something like providentially fashions or constitutes itself. Of course, all of this takes place under providence, under grace, under the sometimes unseen inspirations and impetuses of the Spirit. But Christianity makes progress in the sense which I've just tried to evoke, Newman says, through involvement with the ways of thinking and acting, which in any given historical period are its milieu. This is the constitutive involvement of which I'm trying to speak. Notice, however, that Newman doesn't think, so I'm just making sure I can keep my place in these scattered notes. Newman doesn't think that such involvement as Christianity has with the thought and operation of its milieu, he doesn't think of this simply as Christian conquest. He doesn't think of it as Christianity's destruction or sovereign modification of the ways of thinking and operating by which it is surrounded. Historical modes of thinking and operating are not just destroyed or modified by Christianity, according to Newman, but they are also, he says, incorporated within Christianity. And so I think it is right to say that Newman here affirms a kind of reciprocity. In other words, he wishes to speak not only of influences which Christianity exerts, but also of influences to which it is subject. And this combination of exertion and receptivity, let us call it, if not subjection, this combination is the constitutive historical moment of Christianity's making progress. And the idea becomes quite explicit in a related passage, which I'd like to read for you. An idea, like Christianity, not only modifies, he says, but is modified, or at least influenced by the state of things in which it is carried out, and its dependence in various ways on the circumstances which surround it. Well, now Newman continues as follows with the passage in which he speaks about the way in which Christianity makes progress. Christianity's development, then, he tells us, is not like an investigation worked out on paper in which each successive advance is a pure evolution from a foregoing. Christianity's development, then, he says, is not like an investigation worked out on paper in which each successive advance is a pure evolution from a foregoing. Well, that might take a little bit of unpacking. I think that in a theological context, we should interpret it as being a sort of quietly radical affirmation. What does Newman mean, an investigation worked out on paper? Well, let's think back briefly to those models of apostolic fullness, which I touched upon, both in the case of Newman's own Anglican theology and in a certain style of Catholic theology too. And remember that there are two moments which require explanation in those models. One is the way in which the fullness was first achieved in the apostles, and then secondly, how it comes to be retrieved later after some kind of historical hiatus. And one very influential way of explaining the retrieval within these ways of thinking is that the only way in which retrieval can take place is if something is achieved as a deduction from something already known in the faith. So according to this model, the only way in which something new can emerge, or something apparently novel can come about, is if it can be shown that there is a demonstrable logic through deduction that connects the putatively new thing to an older, already possessed piece of knowledge. This is to effectively say that all development of doctrine within this model is it's desired to trace it to a form of syllogism, which rigorously deduces the conclusion from the premises. This, I think, or some form of this, is what Newman is characterizing as an investigation worked out on paper, in which each successive advance is a pure evolution from a foregoing. What is foregoing, of course, is the premises, the things in some sense already achieved and believed. And what is derived from the premises by a pure evolution is the belief or the doctrine or the formulation, which is in some sense new, but now by this process of pure evolution stands revealed as logically entailed or contained in the earlier situation. Now, it's precisely this as the model for how development takes place that Newman wants to put in question. And of course, it's clear why he would wish to do so, I think, because in one sense, the absolute priority or the exclusive claim of a logical deductive method for explaining development in Christian doctrine is itself another form of that refusal of history about which Newman complains and which we've seen him to be concerned with at various points already. It's a refusal of history because the logical process is in a certain sense and designedly abstract from the historical process. It functions as an alternative to it. It is no longer in historical process that the patterns are a new doctrinal affirmation concerning the faith once delivered to us. No longer in history that this is to be uncovered, but rather through a logical arrangement of propositions and terms that is in a certain sense timeless. And so ahistorical. But in the passage that we're considering, Newman is insisting precisely on the opposite. He's insisting on the contingency with which Christianity unfolds historically. He says it's not like an investigation worked out on paper, in which each successive advance is a pure evolution from what went before. Now, when I speak about Newman insisting on the contingency with which Christianity unfolds historically, what do I mean? Well, I mean by contingency, everything that is humanly unpredictable and unforeseeable in whatever influences Christian development. And it's central to Newman's conception of Christian development that there are unpredictable and unforeseeable things, that the historical process is marked by its contingency, by its unpredictability, its unforeseeability, its amazing confluence of very many kinds of influence from abstract reasoning down to ecclesiastical and imperial politics, personalities, good and bad, the circumstances and the accidents of the moment. In Newman's estimation, all these things are providentially constitutive, or each is partly constitutive or contributes to the constitution of Christian development. Newman contrasts this contingency, which he desires to affirm, with what he calls the pure evolution, which he denies. And if we focus for a moment on what that word pure in the expression pure evolution is meant to evoke, it's precisely an evolution which excludes the impurity of what is contingent, seeking instead to replace it with an explicit and demonstrable logic, by which it is hoped, by some styles of theology, Christian development can be shown to be guided. Newman, however, denies that any such logic underlies Christian development. Or more exactly, it's fair to say that he denies that any such logic must underlie it, and that the only way in which we can make orthodox sense of Christian development is through positing such a logic and trying to bring all the phenomena which command our attention in this field under its rubric and control. It may be that in certain cases, an instance of Christian development, doctrinal development, it may be, chiefly it's a matter of doctrinal development with which Newman is concerned. It may be that in a particular case, there is something more approximate to a kind of purely logical, demonstrable efficacy in the process which produces it. But what Newman denies is that in the ordinary case, or as the standard of our have to have resort to that kind of model. So he denies that any such logic necessarily underlies Christian development. Something, according to Newman, is indeed unfolding, something real and true, a true and momentous identity is expressing itself in history, and this is Christianity. But this is happening through, put it at the beginning of this lecture, rather than in a kind of purified abstraction from them. And in a remarkable passage, Newman even toys a little, I think, with the valences of purity and impurity and the associated notions of safety and risk. It follows, I think, from Newman's insistence upon what I'm calling the contingency of the historical, it follows that there is something which is not under our control as believers, or perhaps not even fully under the church's control, insofar as she is a human Newman is not afraid to talk about this element which exceeds our control as a risk. Whatever be the risk, he says, of corruption from intercourse with the world around, such a risk must be encountered if a great idea is to be duly understood, and much more if it is to be fully exhibited. For such a great idea, he says, is elicited and expanded by trial and battles into perfection and supremacy. So the risk of, he almost says contamination, but he says corruption from intercourse with the world around, such a risk is, in Newman's estimation, at least in this passage, itself partly constitutive of the Christian enterprise. And I shall have something to say about how to interpret that claim in a more settled and, I hope, illuminating way a bit later on. Now, the conclusion of the passage upon which I'm giving this very digressive commentary, the conclusion of the passage goes like this. It's just a short paragraph, but as we can see, it contains within itself a great deal that can be expanded. So the finale is this: the development of Christianity, Newman tells us, is carried on through and by means of communities of men, and their leaders and guides. And it employs their minds as its instruments and depends upon them while it uses them. Carried on through and by means of communities of men and their leaders and guides. And it employs their minds as its instruments and depends upon them while it uses them. Now, here there are 2 points, especially that I'd like to draw to your attention. The first of them is that in Newman's understanding of Christian development, then, he accords a very significant emphasis to the effects of personal influence, to which he refers in the idiom of the day as communities of men and their leaders and guides. And underlying this emphasis upon the effects of personal influence in Christian unfolding, underlying this emphasis is something which is even more pervasive in Newman's thought. And that is his interest in human reasoning as something importantly individual, something profoundly involved in the reasoner's particular character and conscience. And he means this characterization of reasoning to be in opposition to any characterization which emphasizes the universal and impersonal character of reasoning. Newman's tendency is, in other words, to think that in anything which is of real human significance to us, including, therefore, of course, matters of religion, not much can be achieved by reasoning which is universal and impersonal. There is something about this significant subject matter, whether it be religion or many other questions of intellectual or existential gravity in our lives. There's something about this kind of subject, or these kinds of subject matter, he thinks, which necessarily engage what is distinctive in each one who reasons about them, what is singular and individual in him or her. It touches, in other words, according to Newman, upon conscience and broadly the moral character or the ethical dispositions of the person reasoning. And it is a kind of fatal abstraction in Newman's view to try to separate out the pure reasoning from these ethical and affective dimensions of the reasoner. It's not a weakness in this conception of reason that it is enmeshed or profoundly implicated in character and choice. In Newman's estimation, it's on the contrary a sign of its penetration and strength that it should be involved in this way. And it's the universal and impersonal forms of reasoning, or the subject matters to which those universal and impersonal forms of reasoning lend themselves, that are superficial or relatively insubstantial for him. So, I mean, there is a huge topic, of course, involved in what I've just said. But Newman doesn't think that anything important in human life can be decided at a level at which you can abstract from who is reasoning and why he thinks as he does, and what the deep connections are between his practical intellect and his speculative mind. this convergence of theory and praxis, of thought and freedom in Newman is one of the most significant and provocative of his insights. And it shows up here in Newman's insistence on these communities of men and their leaders and guides. A great deal is contained within that emphasis. Now, because of this way that Newman has of thinking about about reasoning and conscience, let's use conscience as a kind of umbrella term to capture the whole ethical and affective dimension of freedom in one who reasons. Because of this convergence between reason and conscience that Newman insists upon, it's also the case that for him, reasoning in the concrete, actual occasions of human thinking are always profoundly influenced by what he calls in the grammar of assent, the sentiments of the age, country, religion, social habits and ideas of the particular inquirers or disputants. So here Newman is very determinedly embedding the concrete course of human thinking in very particular inflections of the cultural and social and individual marks of the one reasoning. In addition, he thinks, in all concrete acts of reasoning, there is also in play this matter that I have referred to as the ethical growth of the individual mind. And this means that, all of this means that there is more in reasoning than can be captured by an impersonal logical form. Newman has a very pronounced impetus in his thought from his Anglican days right through to the grammar of assent and beyond in his Catholic period, to wish to emphasize the greater significance that should be attached to what he calls sometimes informal or implicit reasoning, as opposed to formal and explicit. It's not, of course, that he thinks that formal and explicit reasoning does not have its place, but he thinks that its place is largely occupied by matters which are abstract of deep human concern. And there's no accident about that, because matters of deep human concern involve such a complexity of context and background, as I've been trying to explain through his words: religion, social habits, ideas, sentiments of the age and the country, and so on. So complex, so intangible, so various are the elements that bear upon concrete acts of thinking and reasoning, that they cannot be represented in a formal way. They cannot be explicated and formalized, Newman thinks. Reasoning is always deeply personal. And because of that, he says in another passage from the grammar, which I shall now quote, because of this, it is too keen and manifold. Its sources are too remote and hidden. Its path too personal, delicate and circuitous. Its subject matter too various and intricate to admit of the trammels of any language, of whatever subtlety and of whatever compass. So there is here a very striking sense in which Newman posits that our thinking and all that goes to make it up, even in the context of what you would call natural thinking, that's to say, not necessarily in the context of explicitly Christian commitment or faith-driven reflection. there is just as such in our reasonings something which always exceeds our grasp. We are drawing upon sources which are really active upon us without our being able to bring those active influences or sources clearly and demonstratively into view, so as to be able to construct a formal scheme of thinking that reflects what is going on in us. There is then always this surplus, this hidden or excessive dimension in the relation between the sources of our thought and choices and what we can know and rehearse of those thoughts and choices in an articulate and adequate way. This is, of course, one of the ways in which Newman, though in some ways a very old-fashioned writer to read now for us, nonetheless, this is one of the ways in which he clearly anticipates themes which still sound distinctively modern, or even postmodern, one might say. This notion of the sense in which we always come from more than we can say, and that what we speak only inadequately captures the complexity that underlies it. It's important to see that, I mean, the way in which Newman hopes ultimately to model the whole question of Christian development, and especially the development of doctrine, relies upon this notion of the excess or the disproportion between what can be given to us and what we can say about it. Because his model in the essay on the development of Christian doctrine is precisely that Christianity as a fact, as a mystery, imparts to us an idea, which it is then the labor of history to elaborate. In one sense, it imparts it all at once. And this is the sense, of course, in which Newman remains entirely orthodox and classical in his conception of the definitiveness of the revelation given to the apostles. But what is given to them is an idea which exceeds their ability to explicate. And so they are able to hand on in diverse ways, not necessarily explicitly, the whole Christian idea, which then begins to move through history and to surface and to explain itself insofar as it can in the vicissitudes of its historical encounters. And what makes this possible is, for Newman, is that there's always this surplus in the idea, in what has been communicated, over what has been said. And it takes the stimulus of history for what has been given to show itself. Well, that was all by way of the first point I wanted to make about that final part of the passage. And there's a second point, which is that Newman, in this passage, extends somewhat the theme of the reciprocity of influences, which we touched upon a little bit earlier towards the beginning of the lecture. The influences to which Newman says Christianity is subject in this part of the passage are freshly characterized by him in an interesting way. He says that they are that upon which Christianity depends. And this introduction of the notion of the dependence of Christianity upon individuals and communities is very suggestive, I think, in a way that I will now try to bring out. It's striking that something as momentous and inexhaustible as Christianity is, in Newman's understanding of it, nonetheless allows its unfolding to become subject in a way to the finitude of its disciples. And I'd like to suggest that this way in which Christianity allows itself into this allows itself into this dependence upon its followers and disciples seems in Newman's hands purposefully reminiscent of the primordial Christian movement, whereby the eternal word empties himself into the likeness of sinful flesh. So what I'm suggesting is that there's a kind of imitatio, a kind of participation perhaps, in which Christianity empties itself into the finitude of we who believe it, into our finitude who believe it, in a way which participates or parallels the emptying of the word into the likeness of sinful flesh, as St. Paul puts it. Newman seems to be suggesting, therefore, that there is a kenotic dimension, an element of kenosis, of self-emptying, to Christianity's involvement with the contingencies of history. Christianity offers itself to the contingency of history in the same way as, or in a way that is parallel to, I should say, the offering by himself of the eternal word to the flesh which he takes to himself. And this is a dimension then which is a form of participation by the historical embeddedness of Christianity in the flesh of the word. And it may be that that provides some key, I think, to fully elaborating what Newman wants to say about the relationship between Christianity and its flesh considered as history, or rather history considered as its flesh, the flesh of Christianity, the body taken by Christianity in the sequel to the incarnation, the prolongation of the incarnation, which is the church. There is a kenotic economy and significance, perhaps, to history as the flesh of the church, which continues the offering of the word to human flesh in the incarnation. Now, so finally, I just have one thought which with which to leave the lecture proper, and that is that I think in the end, Newman does not think that when the church teaches a doctrine or propounds for belief something which had not been explicitly part of Christian doctrine before. When this happens, she is not dependent for it upon the arguments of theologians, and she has a kind of sovereign independence from those arguments, which, given what the arguments of theologians are like, is sometimes at least is a good thing, perhaps. Ultimately, for Newman, the capacity to judge what belongs to the deposit of faith and what does not this capacity inheres not in argumentation or formal reasoning or deductive logical demonstrations of entailment or containment of later doctrines in earlier ones, or anything of the kind, though there may be sometimes space for that kind of thing. Ultimately, there's an element of divine illumination and assistance in the churches coming to these conclusions. There's an element of divine enlightenment and assistance in the progress of the church, in the way in which she expresses herself and achieves a doctrinal clarity over time. And this is something which exceeds even her own command, let alone the command of the magisterium of the theologians. Even the church's own command cannot be reduced to these arguments. And I think that Newman sees this clearly, and his emphasis upon the complexity and of reasoning and thinking, and the impossibility of rendering it perspicuously in a formal and explicit way. All of this tends towards the conclusion that there is ultimately something mysterious or unaccountable in the way in which the church lives in history, deploys the historical, and comes to her voice in history. Anyway, those very abbreviated final comments are my last for the time being, and I hope now that there can be some questions and reflections on many things I've said or tried to say. Ah, you're back, good. You'd all gone blank, but now you're back.
Thank you very, very much, Father Philip. Really a very thought-provoking and provocative talk this evening.
Thank you. I see that there are 13 comments in chat.
Yeah, there's been one comment, wonderful talk. Someone who sadly had to leave early, but she sends her thanks. Father Philip, there's a question from one of our participants.
Yes.
Christy, thank you for your presentation. This person asks, to what degree the history of the Jewish people, our brothers and sisters, or the development of science influences the development of Christian doctrine? To what degree do you think that that these factors influence the development?
Well, that's a very good question, and a very complex one. I mean, the answer. I mean, from Newman's perspective, I think that the answer is that for him, the influence of, well, let's say, the Old Testament, that record of Jewish history, which is contained in the Old Covenant, the influence of that upon the form and self-understanding of Christian development is incalculable, I think, because it is from the Old Testament that so many of the anticipations and figures and prophecies of Christian truth and life are drawn. So a great deal of Christian exegesis of the church's understanding of herself draws directly on the types and, in general, the resources that are made available in the theologies of the Old Covenant. That doesn't mean to say that there is not a very important question about the extent to which Christianity might be also thought to extend, or in some sense complete, or perhaps in some sense transform the movements of thought or experience in the Old Covenant, and turn them into something in some way different when it comes to applying them to herself. But those are very delicate and difficult questions. So that's part of that, Jewish people's history. And the development of science, well, yes. Well, I mean, Newman does have some thoughts about that. There's actually so our lecture series is dedicated to faith and reason, is that right? And Newman has a series of 15 sermons preached before the University of Oxford, in fact, all as an Anglican, which extend, I think, from 1826 or 1827 is the first, through to 1843, which is getting very close to the time of his crisis before his conversion in 1845. So they reflect very interesting developments in Newman's thought, but they also are very much a series, and show how certain themes and preoccupations were his from very early on and remained very pervasive. The first of the reason I'm telling you all this is that the first of those sermons, as I remember, is dedicated to the theme of the interaction between the temper of Christianity and the temper of science. And it's a very positive account of that interaction. Newman thinks that science, in the sense in which we now mean it, natural science, owes itself in its inmost inspiration and perspective to Christianity. And he makes an interesting argument to that effect. So I would recommend that anyone who's interested in thinking about Newman and science might start there. It's not the last word, because, as I say, it's a relatively early sermon, but it's a very interesting one. And I think there will be plenty of sort of suggestions for further lines of thought coming from it.
Thank you. And that's John Henry Newman's 15 sermons preached before the University of Oxford between AD 1826 and AD 1843.
That's it, the so-called university sermons, that's right, exactly.
Father, we have another question from one of our participants.
I see it here in front of me.
Perhaps I'll read it so that everyone can understand what you're responding to. Could the adherent of a non-Catholic church, for example, an Orthodox, Anglican church, argue that theirs is the true development of doctrine? How can we argue that ours is the correct development and theirs is not?
Well, that is a very good question. And in his essay, I mean, there's a great deal that I've not dealt with tonight. And one of the most important things that I've not dealt with at all, really, is the fact that in his essay on development, Newman proposes certain notes or criteria for distinguishing authentic from inauthentic, real from unreal, which is a very potent word for Newman, developments. And so there's no simple answer to the question that anonymous attendee asks. Of course, and I'm sure that he or she didn't think there was a simple answer, but the place to start for Newman's response to that question is to look at those notes and to see how he thinks they can be used in order to, I mean, in a kind of apologetic context, which is partly the context of this question, right? To see how they can be used to use the language of that time, vindicate the Catholic claims. Newman does think that there is such a thing as true development, and he thinks that we have criteria for discerning it. Not to emphasize again, not anything that could be used as a proof, because he doesn't think that proof in the sense of demonstration is the appropriate logic for this kind of investigation, as I've tried to say. But he does think that there can be criteria which bring to light converging probabilities, which enable us to discern the truth. But that discernment of the truth is, I think, itself something which sort of partakes in the nature of faith, in the sense that it doesn't claim to see the conclusion that it reaches. It doesn't claim to be able to demonstrate or make the conclusion it reaches absolutely and uncontroversially visible. Just as there is an element of venture or risk, as I've tried to say, in the notion of Christian faith, so there is in the notion of accepting development as authentic when the church has professed it.
Thank you.
I hope that begins to answer that question. It certainly doesn't conclude an answer, but I hope it.
If time permits, there is one more question. And
yes, I see it.
With your permission, Father, I will read the question so that all of our audience hears it. Father, you began by acknowledging that history is the order of the mutable and transitory. I would be grateful if you would comment on the native anti-historical or meta-historical tradition within Christianity as it becomes so explicit in the Greek apologists, Cappadocian fathers, and the continuous attitude of Platonist otherworldliness that emphasizes archetypal deposit of doctrine in the eternal word, and has, of course, undated Christian thought from Iothus to the 12th century Chartres to the Renaissance itself. How do you or John Henry Newman reconcile the historicist and metaphysical imperatives of Christian doctrine?
Well, I mean, that's also a very good question, and as I would expect from the one who asks it. Well, I think that in fact Newman is in some ways quite close to the perspective that the questioner wants to bring to light here. Let's take what he says, the continuous attitude of Platonist otherworldliness that emphasizes an archetypal deposit of doctrine in the eternal word. Now, I think there's something in that which is resonant with Newman, because remember that I was trying to speak about the way in which, in the idea that communicates itself to us, there is always something excessive of our ability to formulate it, or to amply and adequately capture it. It seems that ultimately, I mean, Newman thinks that this idea is the person of Christ himself, incarnate indeed, but also the eternal word. And in some sense, he's very open to the idea that the whole mystery of Christianity is in fact hidden in the person of the eternal word. Admittedly, for him, it's the eternal word made flesh. And that's why the interaction with the historical is also important for him. I mean, it might indeed be said that even in the most robust Platonist otherworldliness, there is some significance in the encounter with that order of being which participates in the archetype. Some significance is given to the way in which the finite participant in the world, or the world itself as finite participant in the archetype, some significance is given to how that works, and what its significance for us, at least here and now, might be. So I think that there are perspectives within what I've been trying to say tonight that open out what Newman is saying to the perspective that Harley is urging on us. Certainly, it's the case, and it's very important to what Newman thinks, that the archetype, to use this language, is inexhaustible historically. But he does also want to say that it has an interaction, or I should say that the historical has an interaction with the archetype. That's a very primitive beginning.
Well, Father, I actually have a question, if I may, and I'm hoping it will be. We're living in a world, a secular world, that is all about a cancel culture. And history, it's quite distressing. I mean, I look at, my son, a university student, probably some of those participating in this program this evening. It's just surrounding us. It's cancel culture, cancel history. It has, and I'm listening tonight to your really thoughtful presentation, and just on the importance of history and the interaction. And I mean, what would John Henry Newman have to say today to those the proponents of this cancel culture approach?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, you're right, I think, to see cancel culture as a kind of an erasure, or an attempted erasure of, among other things, an attempted erasure of history. It's an attempt just to sort of annihilate what is complicated or ambivalent, or in some sense repugnant, perhaps, about history, and to provide perhaps a purified genealogy, or perhaps no genealogy at all. Perhaps the ideal of cancel culture is that we are only and purely contemporary, according to the standards that we promulgate for ourselves. And I think that Newman would see this attempt to amputate the historical as a kind of inhuman or anti-human motive. And he would want to recall us to the complexity of our origins and of the history that precedes us. And it's true that its ambiguities and complexities can be distressing. I mean, quite generally, not just in respect of the particular preoccupations of cancel culture, but quite generally that's true. And he knows that from his own experience as a Christian. He's a very undeceived reader of Christian history and tradition in some ways. But he would say that we have no option but to find ways of living with that ambivalence. And it may be that in the end, it's very difficult to live with the ambiguities of history at all without faith. Difficult enough with faith, perhaps, but perhaps all the more difficult without it. Perhaps he would see in cancel culture an attempt at a kind of self-generated redemption, when in truth, whatever it is that can heal the past and its legacies doesn't doesn't come from us, who are just its causes ultimately, right? So I think he would try to find a perspective within Christianity, within Christian faith, that would shed light on it. My own feeling is that he would be disinclined. Well, it depends on it depends on what Newman you're talking about. You know, Newman in what period of his life. But I think that, you know, he would be disinclined to enter into explicit polemics about it, but would try to find ways of offering a Christian interpretation of the whole phenomenon.
On that note,
Does that help? Something like
that was brilliant. Really very riveting presentation this evening, Father Philip, and your engagement in the questions was even equally so. Really, thank you so very much on behalf of the human community and our guests who have dropped in from perhaps across the GTA. We really so very much appreciate your taking the time and sharing with us your very, very provocative thinking in terms of John Henry Newman. So thank you, and the development of doctrine. I will now turn it over. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
I will now turn it over to Lenita with some final remarks.
Hi, yes, thank you, Father. Thank you for your invitation, for accepting our invitation and saying yes. And to Catherine Pollock, the president of our foundation here at Newman, and she does many things here at Newman. Thank you for accepting the invitation to come join us and moderate this question and answer. And taking over when, just so everyone's aware that despite being virtual, we do have a few people watching on a bigger screen who don't have access to computers at home. We have a few seats downstairs and they are full tonight. So I want to thank everyone who's attended from home and who have come and made the trip to Newman. And I want to tell you that our next event is on November 11th. Again at 7 p.m. It'll be with Reclaiming an Ordered Soul in an Age of Distraction, and it is with Dr. Joshua Hochschild, and he'll be joining us again virtually. Our programming is virtual this fall, and we look forward to seeing you then. Have a good night. Thanks again, everyone.
Night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you.